This series of talks, Searching for Religious Self-Awareness, was recorded by St. Anthony Messenger Press. The speaker is Father James Basic.
It really is important to be in the business of trying to improve our religious self-awareness, trying to get more in touch with the depth dimension of our ordinary experience, trying to bring into our conscious life the things that often lurk on the edge of our consciousness. It often helps in improving our religious self-awareness to get involved more with questions outside of ourselves, at least to be able to look at other people and to see how they have dealt with some of these great mysteries that have engaged all human beings throughout history. Now I'd like to turn to the question of how we experience mystery in our lives. Put in older classical terms, it was really often phrased in terms of, well, how do I experience God in my life? But one of the problems in the modern world is that the very question of God has become a problem for many people. Whereas if I simply say to some people, well, how do you experience God? Their reaction to me might be, well, what do you mean by the word God? Or other people might say to me at that point, well, you mean that one who is up above us all and who intervenes periodically. Well, he never intervenes in my life, therefore I don't have any experience of God. So there is a problem, in other words, in the very way that we ask the question. And to pose it just in terms of, well, how do you experience God in your life probably isn't going to work very well. So we need another way, more neutral way of posing the question, so that when we begin to look at our experience, we don't rule anything out too quickly. We could say, well, how do we experience the transcendent in our life? That word might be helpful, but I prefer the language of mystery. It is the language that Karl Rahner has used in his own writings, and it seems to me to have certain advantages. So if I ask myself, how do I experience mystery in my life, I seem to be open to many different ways in which that might happen. I want to probe all of my human experience to see if there are not hidden depths there that I have often obscured. I want to look at the whole of my life, both its negative and positive sides, to see if I can't find in some ways there a gracious mystery that is indeed at work. So this is the kind of question that we're involved in. Now, I think for most of us, the problem is that we have turned off parts of our experience. We may not be in touch with the unconscious part of it. We may not take our dreams seriously. We may feel that God could never reach us in the ordinary times of life. We might think that it's only the positive and good things where God speaks to us. We might find that he speaks to us through nature, but never through personal relationships, because in some way or another those are not fulfilling or not going well for us. So the problem is that for many of us we can limit the possibilities of how mystery might be experienced. So we have to start with a wide open way, a very neutral way of beginning to explore the question. So I suggest that we all begin to think in these terms. How do I experience mystery in my life? How does the uncanny, which produces both awe and wonder, come to me? Where do I find the extraordinary right within the ordinary in my own existence? Some of these ways help us, in other words, to get in touch with areas of our life and depths of our experience that ordinarily might be repressed or hidden or forgotten, or which we never talk about or articulate well. Now, it often helps when we begin to probe these great questions to begin to look at some outstanding figure who might exemplify this particular search, who's wrestled with this question in a particularly sharp and intense way. And often if we can begin to see life from their viewpoint, then it will enrich our own understanding. If we're able to pass over to these people and see the world through their eyes, we may return to ourselves enriched. If we're able to read their story intelligently, it might help us to read our own story in better fashion. If we stop and meditate or reflect on what they have gone through, it may well enrich our own understanding. Now, for this particular question of how I experience mystery in my life, I'd like to look at the life of Thomas Merton. Thomas Merton, a 20th century figure again, a story well known to many people, retold in his great autobiography, Seven Storey Mountain. Story of a young man who lived a rather rough and undisciplined life for a while and was converted to Catholicism. Eventually entered a Trappist monastery, did a lot of writing while he was in that monastery. Eventually, near the end of his life, journeyed to Thailand, where he was unfortunately electrocuted in 1968, with still, I think, many good things to accomplish and do in his life. Well, now, Merton is a man of the 20th century in some ways. He represents still a classical understanding of the Catholic religion, and yet it seemed as though he struggled throughout his life to make that faith relevant to the contemporary world, and he seemed to be a man who was constantly developing and growing, all the way to the end of his life when he was interested in furthering his important investigations of Eastern religions. And that's what he was doing in Thailand, as attending conferences and being with people from other religious backgrounds. So Merton does represent an interesting figure for us, an appealing one. That book, Seven Story Mountain, was on the bestseller list for a while, and his writings still seem to be popular. And I know when I teach courses to undergraduates and Merton is brought up, I still find an interest in him, which is quite remarkable since he lived the life of a Trappist monk and spent a good part of his time in the monastery. Now, Merton is good because he, in his own life, had a great variety of religious experiences, which help us, I think, to begin to look at our own experience. So by looking at the way different types of experience he had, we may get clues as to where to look in our own life. And the first thing I would like to note is his conversion experience. He did lead the life of the ordinary university student in Columbia, in New York, at Columbia University. He had his share of carousing and running around. He speaks a lot about spending time at the bars and so on. He was not terribly religious at that time at all. He was a journalist, spent a lot of his time writing. But there came a point when that seemed to be a little bit dull to him and not really fulfilling. And through a series of encounters with important people in his life and some of the readings that he did, he turned his life around. He decided to take instructions and to become a Catholic. He studied hard to do that. He made an intelligent and systematic effort to understand the traditional Catholic faith. And he changed his way of life as a result. He was converted, therefore, as a young man, and the Seven Story Mountain tells the story of that conversion. Now, that experience of conversion sets up a discussion of that whole part of religious experience, the conversion experience, a very common one. The great example of that really is the experience of St. Augustine and his own movement away from the life of a playboy to a life of conversion to Christian faith and then becoming a bishop. A rather sudden turnaround in his life. And I think that it becomes important to have a way of looking at this conversion experience, and we ought to do that with the view of seeing, are there ways in which I undergo conversion experiences, maybe minor ones compared to Augustine and Thomas Merton, but ways in which conversion both happens in my life and is needed. Well, first of all, we need sort of a framework for understanding this. And I think the first way is to begin with ourselves, to realize that indeed we are dynamic creatures. We are, as I like to say, self-transcendent beings. That is, we're always moving beyond our current place. We have this desire to know more and to love more. There's built into our lives sort of a drive for conversion, to overcome the evil in our life, to deal with the negativities, and to become better human beings, to move towards a greater integration and maturity. So it's built into us to have this possibility of jumping to a new level, of straightening our lives out, of turning ourselves around. What we find is that as we're going along and in life, we find that no particular bit of progress ever satisfies us. We always seem to be called upon to do more. We could say, well, I have been converted once, or I've made a series of conversions. Isn't that enough? And it seems as though we're called upon to make continual progress in our life. No particular achievement really satisfies us. We're moving towards a mystery in life that's always beyond our comprehension and control. It seems like we can never say in life that we really have arrived. It seems like it's possible in life to begin to notice things that we never noticed before, and to account things as real that we have just set to the side and said were unimportant. It really is possible for us to change our value systems and begin to treasure things that in the past we didn't think were important for us. So this conversion experience in life does seem to be a possibility, and not only that, but really a demand in a sense. We're called upon to always be converting ourselves. Now, we might try to ask what this process is all about. William James did the classic study on this way back in the early part of the century in his great book, Varieties of Religious Experience. And he talked about conversions as involving a new permanent focus in life. A particular aim takes over and dominates our attention. We become transformed in a way. He spoke about having a new habitual center of energy which takes us over and keeps us going. A new hot place in our consciousness now becomes dominant. Now in our lives, when there's a religious conversion, a new religious ideal takes us over. So it's interesting language that James uses. What he's suggesting is there's this turnaround, this new thing that happens within us, so that there is now a new center out of which we work. We feel like different people. There's new concerns dominating our attention and new values which are motivating us. Now, it seems as though for James that there were two types of conversion, the gradual ones and the sudden ones. And he talked about the usual way in which there seems to be a process in which people are working up to it. They might become dissatisfied, as Merton did with his previous life. He bought one of Jill Sohn's books and began to read it. He found interesting lectures on Thomism in Columbia University. In other words, you can see that there is a process going on inside of him that begins to make him think in new ways. And then a decisive point comes when he acts on those various psychic forces that have been going on within his own mind and heart. That would have sort of a gradual character to it. On other times, it seems as though it is so sudden. It just comes so quickly, where a person is living a profligate life or throwing away their time and energy, or they're on drugs or drinking too much, and one day they wake up and just say, that's it. I'm turning that around. I remember a young man coming in to me and telling me that it was like that. He had no real knowledge of anything going on inside of himself, and he was on drugs. His life was messed up. It was going downhill, and he woke up and it was just that sudden. He says, I can't live like this anymore. I don't want to live like this anymore. And he really did begin to turn his life around, and seemingly with no real preparation. Now, James was of the opinion that what was happening in people undergoing sudden conversions was that their unconscious was at work. There were other factors going on. Maybe the dissatisfaction was brewing down there someplace, and a new way of life had presented itself. Maybe this young man had met some other person who was living a better life and showed a new way of doing it. Or maybe the taking of the drugs began to somehow mess him up in a way that he hadn't anticipated. But anyway, James was of the opinion that there were hidden things going on, and that the sudden conversions were not as sudden as one might think. But I think his great value to us is that he gives us some sense of this process that is going on, and a language or a way of talking about it. It would enable us to sort of be on alert for ways perhaps in which I find myself involved in such religious conversions. That maybe I could try to heighten my own ability to achieve this, maybe by increasing my emotional sensibility, or trying to be more in touch with the unconscious at his work, being aware of my dreams and so on, trying to be willing to listen to other people who may have good ideas and so on. Maybe there's people around who are calling me out of myself, or calling me forward, or saying, become a better person. Perhaps your spouse is doing that, or a teacher is doing that for you, or a student who really in either explicit or more subtle ways is saying, hey, you could do better. You could be a better kind of person. So I think we sort of need to be on alert for those demands or calls to convert ourselves. I find other illumination on this question of conversion from the thought of Bernard Lonergan, who helps us to understand that maybe the conversion experiences are really of different types, and there's different elements involved in it. So we could distinguish out, following Lonergan, 4 different kinds of conversions that would happen: an affective, an intellectual, a moral, and a religious conversion. Now let's talk a little bit about each one of those. First, we would talk about the affective conversion, which means that somehow we're becoming more open to our emotional experience in life. That very many of us live blocking in some way on our emotions, so that we either repress the negative kinds of things, or we're not able to enjoy the good things of life. You find some people who can't laugh easily. You find some people who can't cry easily. So in one way or another, it seems that many of us feel blocked in our emotional life. So an emotional conversion experience would mean somehow that we've learned to be in touch with that. It might mean that I am crying where I couldn't cry before. Or sometimes I always can tell when people are getting healthier who have psychic problems because their laughter changes. The laughter becomes deeper and richer very often because now it's more spontaneous, and the blocks to feeling this good sense of life have been removed. What this would call for us to do is to stop and think, is the mystery element of life somehow working within me through my emotions? And am I somehow cutting that off or blocking that and not aware of this call? So to have an emotional conversion, in the or an affective conversion, the way I'm talking about it here, would simply mean that I am now more in touch with my deeper feelings and more responsive to them and more willing to try to take them into account in building my life and trying to perform more effectively. Now, the second type of conversion that Lonergan would suggest is an intellectual conversion. This would be the decision, in a sense, to take responsibility for my learning as an adult. This would mean that I would say, I'm going to try to avoid prejudices in my life, try to put aside the biases that usually cloud my judgment, that I would try to overcome the oversights in my life, the things that I habitually don't look at. It would mean that we would try to transcend appearance and try to get at what is really real in our lives. An intellectual conversion means, I think, that we would be willing to think for ourselves. We would really, much as Merton did. See, Merton was just going along with the crowd, doing with what the other people seemed to be doing. And it seemed at some point he felt the need to think for himself, to decide what I want to make of my life. Do I just want to drift like this, or do I want to take hold and do something worthwhile with it? So I believe that here that Merton again would be a guide to an intellectual conversion. He did reading and connected with it. He took instructions in the Catholic faith so that he could make an honest kind of decision about what he wanted to do. Again, it would ask us to check ourselves out. Do we do things just because they feel good? Is it really true that all of our emotions are appropriate and we just have to go along with them? Is it true that every bright idea we get really turns out to be valid? I think we have to say no. Those need correctives. Intellectual conversion would mean we would try to be reasonable about our lives, try to make good decisions about what ought to be done. Now, the third kind of conversion would be a moral conversion. This would be now a decision to act in a responsible way, to try to transcend our own self-interest and try to act on behalf of other people. Moral conversion in life would be the type of thing we do when we break out of our selfishness, when we move from adolescence. That's one way of thinking of what happens moving from adolescence to adulthood. There is a conversion away from self-centeredness, of being self-conscious, of always worrying about one's image and how I'm coming across to others and being worried about peer pressure and so on, to moving to a stage of adulthood where we now decide to act for others, where we become more loving, benevolent in our attitude, where we think, I've got to serve in this world or make a contribution in this world of mine. So I believe that we could all again look at where there are needs for moral conversions. Where do I lack responsibility? I was with a woman the other day and we were in a meeting and she said, she was giving a committee report, and she says, I really feel as though I was not responsible in this situation. And I think it was very refreshing to hear that. she was taking responsibility for the fact that she hadn't handled something well and said it quietly and I think without excessive guilt feelings in a group. I didn't act responsibly, and I think all of us would probably have times when we ought to be willing to say that. When we've failed to take responsibility for our own lives and for the decisions we're making and for the things that we owe to others. Now, the fourth category of conversion would be what he would call a religious conversion then. Now, here brings in the explicit element of God. This would involve a surrender to God. This would where we would decide to live out of religious values, where we would decide, for example, to take the Scriptures seriously, or try to look at the life of Jesus and say, well, really, how ought I live in life? How did Jesus teach me to live? I think this perhaps would be something that we need to do in terms of a religious kind of question. So religious conversion would mean I actually turn myself over to God. We hear a lot of people talking like this these days. We recall where people say, I found out I could not handle life myself, that it became too much for me, and I turned my life over to God. And very often these people talk about experiencing some sort of liberation in that, and I really think that's true. A lot of their language, maybe puts people off about second baptism or birth again and all of that, but I believe the experience they're describing is really authentic, where they feel liberated, freed, because they've turned their life over to God in some way. So what we've got here is a conversion experience. When people undergo conversion experiences, things change for them. They see the life of the world now in new ways. Often they'll say, the world looks beautiful to me now. They'll see truths that they never saw before. And there's values that they treasure now. There's often an assurance and a peace that goes with this, a sort of happiness and ecstasy. And Merton will talk about that in his own life. He'll say that there was a peace that came in his heart. It wasn't complete and total, and that's why he felt the need, I think, eventually to go to the Trappists. But there was certainly a better feeling about himself. He definitely and clearly felt closer to his God as a result. Now, I think that it might be good to move on to a second category of experience, because Merton, in between the time of his conversion and going to the monastery, had another very striking kind of experience. It is what we call a mystical experience, and it would be the second type that we want to deal with. Now, there was a time after his conversion when Merton traveled to Cuba, and he did spend time looking at churches and so on. He traveled around, and then there was a Sunday morning when he ended up in the Church of St. Francis in Havana. He had been to communion already in another church, but he came to hear another Mass, and the building was crowded, and up front there were rows and rows of children who were all crowded together. He wasn't really sure if they were making their first communion or not. But then came time for the consecration. The priest raised the host, and then he raised the chalice. When he put the chalice down on the altar, suddenly a friar in his brown robe and white cord stood up in front of the children, and all at once the voices of the children burst out their statement of faith, I believe in God the Father Almighty. And it was that creed and their cry of that, in Spanish of course, that really struck him. And as this happened, he recounts his experience this way. He says, then, as sudden as the shout, and as definite, and 1,000 times more bright, there formed in my mind an awareness, an understanding, a realization of what had just taken place on the altar at the consecration, a realization of God made present by the words of consecration in a way that made him belong to me. But what a thing it was, this awareness. It was so intangible, and yet it struck me like a thunderclap. It was a light that was so bright that it had no relation to any visible light, and so profound and so intimate that it seemed like a neutralization of every lesser experience. And yet the thing that struck me most of all was that this light was in a certain sense ordinary. It was a light. And this most of all was what took my breath away. That was offered to all, a light that was offered to all, to everybody. And there was nothing fancy or strange about it. It was the light of faith, deepened and reduced to an extreme and sudden obviousness. Now that would be an example of a classical mystical type experience. And I think that it points our attention again to the ways in which perhaps we might find mystical experiences in our own lives. Perhaps not as full-blown as the one that Merton went through, but indeed I believe that we could all find what Maslow called peak experiences in our lives, moments of integration and peace. We should remember that mystical experiences really have nothing to do with seeing visions or hearing voices. They're not the same as apparitions of Jesus or the Blessed Virgin Mary. Mystical experiences have as their major point the sense of the unity of the world. It was, as Merton said, there is often described a light that infuses everything. There is a sense that all people and all things, the whole of the created universe, hang together, that they are of a piece, that there's an inner unity that often escapes the ordinary superficial glance at things. Religious mystical experiences, therefore, are often give one a sense of the commonness of the human situation. After mystics have these experiences, they often have a greater feel for people who are different, because in their mind they see the underlying unity that really binds all human beings together. And so I think it would be important for us to try to look a bit at this mystical experience and see if we don't find it within ourselves. Again, you can think of the great mystical experiences that people have had of all different religions, and very often there's a commonness about them. But if we focus, I think, on this sense of integration and peace and harmony, to see perhaps that we are more mystical than we might at first think. There are really other characteristics to these authentic mystical experiences. For one thing, the mystic feels as though it is a gift. Sometimes there can be preparation for it. People will talk about doing meditation and preparing themselves, being more and more receptive to the receiving of this. But when it finally comes, this great moment of illumination and so on, the person usually feels, I didn't have that coming. It was clearly a gift from God. The mystical experience usually provides some insight into what life is all about. There's a bit of knowledge that comes. In fact, the mystics will say they now know things in a new way that they really never knew before. And they see something true and beautiful and good about life that really has passed them by in the past. And usually the mystic will say that the experience didn't last long, that there was the fact of the matter is that it occurred rather quickly. I think that's the way it was with Merton. It was just the consecration of the Mass and what was going on there, and it was just a fleeting kind of experience. But the thing is, it affects them for the rest of their lives. It's something they carry with them. While it lasts only a few minutes at most, it seems, it really carries over. They feel transformed. They really see the world differently from then on. And most of the mystics say that the experience is really unspeakable. It's ineffable. You can't talk about it. They feel tongue-tied as they try to tell us what it's all about. And yet many of them have attempted to do that, and they find their imaginative and symbolic ways of speaking about it, always trying to tell us about this great sense of unity they have had with the reality that runs the world, with this mystery that really is in everything. They feel united with that, and they feel united with all of the created world that they live in. Now, if we stop and think a bit about that mystical type experience, we probably, most of us at least, would have to say, well, I never had an experience quite as sharp as Merton had. And yet, perhaps that we have more of those types of experience than we ever realized. Abraham Maslow found this out when he was talking about peak experiences, which have many of the same characteristics. If he described those to people and said, well, the peak experience is when you feel integrated and peaceful and so on, people would say, well, no, I never had one of those. But when he would graphically describe one or have a poetic statement given by a person who actually had a peak experience, as people would listen to it, they say, oh, yeah, I've had one of those. And so I think that's the way it is with the mystics. The value of reading people like Teresa of Avila or John of the Cross or our modern-day mystics like Teilhard de Chardin or Thomas Merton is that their descriptions very often ring bells within our own psyche. they somehow touch chords in us and say, well, yes, there were minor ways in which at times I have felt unified, or I have felt that there's a commonness with my friends that I often missed in the past, or I believed that God was close and running the world and in me and the source of my strength and energy in life. So what I think talk of mysticism would do is alert us to the ways in which our own good experiences in life, our positive experiences of integration and wholeness and peace, may well be coming from a source beyond ourselves. It would be alerted to sometimes say, thank you in those joyful moments. I appreciate this time when I end up feeling good and when I am at one with other people, with nature, and with my God. Now there's a third kind of experience that I would like to look at, and that I will call prophetism, or the prophetical religious experience. Again, Merton here is very instructive. The interesting thing about Merton is that after he went into the monastery, he remained concerned with the great social issues of his time, with racial questions, peace and war, for example. Now before he went into the monastery, he was into that world. He had a fleeting period of time when he was a Marxist, and he had times when he worked in the inner city in New York and tried to help people. So he had a developed social sense, or at least a beginning social sense. However, you would think that when he went into the monastery and was living this life of solitude and silence, and that he would be caught up just in his own private world of prayer. But for Merton, that didn't happen. That kind of reflective activity of stepping back from the world sharpened his awareness of the great social issues of his time. He used to get correspondence periodically from people telling him what was going on these great social questions. And he wrote some beautiful and powerful things in response. One of his collections of essays is called, mentions the conjectures of a guilty bystander, it's called, where he focuses on these questions of social justice and feels his own guilt and in his inability to get more involved, and in his lack of awareness, and so on. Conjectures of a guilty bystander. But as a matter of fact, Merton was hardly a bystander. He took great interest in these causes, wrote very important things, had tremendous things to say about peace and war, wrote great satires on war, and great calls for peace in the world. So he ended up playing the prophet as well as being the mystic. He really put before us a true balanced kind of Christian response. He pointed out to us that religious experience is not just involved in me and God and this great sense of unity in the mystical experience, but it involves dealing with other people, of trying to straighten the world out, of spread the kingdom, humanizing the world, trying to be a peacemaker in our world. That is part of religious experience as well. And I think we need to attend to that. We need to realize that. There's some people who talk about religious experience as though it's only involved with this mystical sort of thing, only involved in prayer life or liturgy, and that really must be countered. I think there's a truth of the matter is that some people have found their finest religious moments in being involved in the social apostolate. Some people who were on marches, or stood up for causes, or perhaps did as simple things as writing letters to their congressman about particular social questions, have found in that an intimation and a clue to the presence of mystery. Some people who have been working side by side on some social issue have reported that they felt a sense of solidarity. They felt lifted out of themselves. They felt dedicated to a cause bigger than themselves, and there was an exhilaration and a liberation involved in that. Now, the prophet also has very negative experiences. The prophet often is the one who senses the distance between how it ought to be and how it really is. The characteristic phrase in the scriptures of the prophet is, "Thus says the Lord God." And the prophets like Amos, for example, were people who were passionately concerned about social justice. So very often the prophet, or the prophetic experience, feels the pain of the suffering in the world, feels the difficulty that people are going through, feels an empathy with the poor, the oppressed, the marginalized, and senses that, hey, we ought to do something about it. So the prophetic experience should not be set aside as an inferior experience. The prophet feels the transcendence of God, the fact that the mystery is in judgment upon the world, that the mystery is greater than we are, that there's a creator who's running this world, and he wants it to be right. He wants us to live in harmony, and yet very often we're not doing that. And the prophet senses the sin, the guilt, the judgment of God in the world and speaks out. And that's what Merton did, spoke out. And I think that calls us again to say, couldn't there be perhaps more prophetic religious experience in my own life? It isn't true that I would somehow get further away from my God by helping the poor or working for peace. Just the contrary. Doing those things is precisely the way I would encounter my God, come closer to the one who calls me always to move out of myself and to move into a real sense of solidarity with other people, working on behalf of social justice. So, we have that third kind of category, the prophetic religious experience. Now, I think that perhaps we could go on and to really come up with other kinds of categories of experience. One that I would try to point out here is religious experience that is bound up in the ordinary. One of the interesting things that Merton did was he wrote a fine piece about his touring the monastery grounds in the evening when he was closing it up and so on, doing such a simple task as closing doors and checking out that everything was as it should be for the evening. And in that experience, he finds his God again. The mystery appears to him in this very simple and ordinary, routine kind of task. And that would alert us again to another type of religious experience, if I can call it that, is finding the extraordinary in the ordinary. The mystery often appears to us in the things of life, in the simple things. I feel that many people miss a big part of religious experience and because they're looking for the extraordinary thing. They're waiting to have this strong mystical experience or this great insight into what to do about social justice or getting knocked off their horse or something. Whereas the trick of the matter is to be attentive to the deeper meanings in our ordinary activities, so that the mystery is to be found in family life, in mothers trying to be patient with their children, and fathers working hard and putting the bread on the table, and all of the fights and disagreements that go on in family life and the attempts to reconcile that. All of these things can be the catalyst for the presence of the mystery for all of us. It means being attentive, for example, to our personal relationships, common part of our whole existence. We interact with other people all the time. And how often do we find God precisely in that kind of interaction? That would seem to be a really important place to look. In fact, as we look at our ordinary experience, perhaps our personal relationships with others would be a prime place to look. Because other human beings are inherently mysterious, because a lot of our strong emotional sense in life is bound up in being close to other people. A lot of times I will, on retreats and so on, I will ask people to try to probe their personal relationships for these intimations of the presence of mystery. And I will take people through a process in which I will ask them to write down one really striking encounter with another human being. And it doesn't, again, have to be some extraordinary thing, but something that was significant, meant a lot to them. And I ask them to write that down, and we begin to reflect on it then. And I give them some clues as to how to look at it. I will give them a little analysis of human love, for example, in which we talk about love as the ability to break out of our own selfishness, to try to want the good of the beloved, to try to want the other one to reach individuality and full personhood, the sense of mutuality that goes on, the sense of giving and receiving. In other words, a little description of what human love ought to be about, and then ask them to analyze the experience from that particular viewpoint. Now, after doing that, then I would ask them to see what kind of image of God would emerge from that. I mean, once you look at the way there was love in this relationship and the way there was some deeper dimension, how would you image God? How would you end up describing the God who was revealed to you precisely in that experience? So some person may say that, the striking experience they remember is when another person forgave them. They were really guilty, and when they came up, they expected the other person to really yell at them and be down on them and so on. And the other person, instead of doing that, said, "Hey, that's all right." They tossed it off and said, "Let's start over again, and let's not worry about what happened there." They didn't demand any big explanations and so on. That would be a very liberating, good experience in life to have another human treat us like that. Well, the image of God that emerges from that may well be the image that Jesus portrayed in the prodigal son story, a God who's marvelous in his forgiving capacity, a God who's just madly and improbably lavishing his love upon us, who's always says his first word to us is peace and start again. So that kind of image of God could well come to mind. And then what I ask people to do is somehow to relate that to some story in the Bible. For example, the prodigal son story, as I suggested. To try to root that in a larger tradition, to try to find words for explaining that deeper experience. So what I've asked people to do, in other words, is to reflect in a deeper fashion upon an ordinary experience involved in a personal relationship, to try to mine the riches of it, to understand the workings of love there, to see the mystery operative, and then try to link that with an image of God, a picture of God that emerges, a description of God, and then to try to see how that goes along with the tradition in which we were raised. Now this would be an exercise that is meant to help us to probe this deeper dimension of what is going on with all of us, I think, to get us in touch with the mystery. Now, as we go through all of this, I think there really is true to say that there's really two different modes or types of experience that emerge. Put it this way. We could talk about a boundary experience or an ecstatic experience. I'm borrowing that language from David Tracy, among others. But that there's certain kinds of experiences where we sense our limit or boundary, that we can't handle it. There's a sickness we can't get over. I'm not smart enough to deal with this. There's not enough love in my life. Finally, the great boundary is death. These are limit experiences or boundary experiences where we run up against the limits of what we are able to do. And when we do that, it seems like we're thrown back upon ourselves, where we begin to sense the inadequacy of our own resources. We begin to sense that we're dependent upon a power greater than ourselves. And when we deal constructively with those boundary situations, I think we clearly have a religious type experience. We have an experience in which somehow we feel that there's a power greater than ourselves that helps us to deal with all of those limits that are always plaguing us. This is really, although the experience is quite negative in a way, and we feel bad about it in some ways, there's a ray of hope underneath it. There's a power and strength that's sustaining us in the midst of that. Now, the other type of experience is the ecstatic one. This has a more positive side to it. This is the full-blown, this would be the mystical experience where God is seen to be close. Put at a lower level, it's just the sense that things are right with the world. Peter Berger says that when the mother picks up the crying baby and holds it and says, okay, honey, that's all right, that is this affirmation of this ecstatic type experience. What it's saying is the world can be trusted. It's okay. And there is a God who's at work in this world. It doesn't mean that the youngster will never be sick or isn't in pain now. It means overall the world can be trusted. There's a good force at work. There's a gracious power. And this is what's behind all of our ecstatic experiences. Now, I think there's a couple dangers there. One is that sometimes we forget to thank God in those good experiences. We don't link it with God. We just think life's going great. It's really smooth now. Terrific. But what we ought to learn to do is to attribute that to the great gracious source that's giving us all these things. And with the boundary experience, our thing is often to look on the negative side of it, to feel down, to feel like life can't be handled, to get sort of despondent over it. Whereas these negative things do have the power, same kind of power, to open up the mystery to us, to get us in touch with the one who's really running this world. Well, we've looked at all kinds of religious experience. Our question has been, how do I experience mystery in my life? Then the suggestion is that there's so much more to it than meets the eye. The extraordinary is always lurking within the ordinary. The uncanny is there to give us awe and wonder. The mystery is all around us, and what we've got to do is open our eyes to that, be alert to it, try to hear the voice of God who's calling us, try to see His presence in the whole world, and feel the divine power that's warming and strengthening us.
All rights to this talk are reserved by St. Anthony Messenger Press, 1615 Republic Street, Cincinnati, Ohio, 45210. This series of talks, Searching for Religious Self-Awareness, was recorded by St. Anthony Messenger Press. The speaker is Father James Basic.
in trying to improve our religious self-awareness, it's important that we don't allow ourselves just to skirt around on the surface of things. It seems in life we're always in danger of living superficially, of just going through the motions, of letting the routines of life take us over. We get involved in the rat race of life, and it seems that we often don't take the time to sit back and reflect on what's going on. It seems difficult to try to become a better reader of our own story. And so it is important for us to take time and begin to reflect on some of the great questions that human beings have always dealt with, to try to get down to the center of things, the things that are important to us, the significant kind of questions. And one of those really has to do with our freedom, the question of what we make of our own freedom. In one sense, the question of freedom is a theoretical one. It's the question of, are we really free or not, or are we determined in our behavior? Sometimes we could argue about how our free will is related to our intelligence. We could wonder about how our individual freedom is related to the various communities in which we live. We could ask what the ultimate source of our freedom is. All of those are sort of speculative kind of questions that have interested people over the years. But really, we want to concern ourselves with more practical kinds of questions. That is, how do I really become a free and responsible person? How do I really engage my freedom actively and constructively in this world of ours? What is my ideal of what a free person really would be like? What ultimate goals dominate or shape the decisions that I am making in life? In what ways have I taken hold of my life, and in what ways have I merely drifted along? What kind of a person do I really wish to become? What cultural images shape my actions? And it's really a question, therefore, of how I achieve an authentic kind of freedom. How do I become a free and responsible human being? The question of freedom is very close to the whole business of being human. It's at the very center of our whole effort to become better human beings. Now, as we begin to reflect a bit on the question of freedom, it often seems helpful to try to get in mind some of those images of what the free person might be like, to be able to look at a flesh and blood example of a human being who we would say that person acted responsibly and freely. We'd like to pass over to somebody who really could tell us more about what freedom is all about, both in word and in action. And the person who comes to my mind in that kind of search is Dr. Martin Luther King. Dr. King not only talked a lot about freedom, but he lived as a free person, and of course he tried to free those who were oppressed and downtrodden in our own society. Remember that Dr. King was born in 1929 in the city of Atlanta, that he ended up going to a seminary, Crozer Seminary in Pennsylvania. He continued his studies at Boston University and got his doctorate in theology. He was a man who knew things about the theological and philosophical tradition. He was a good student during that time. He studied the thought of people like Paul Tillich and went through the writings of some of the existentialist thinkers. He came into contact with the thought of Mohandas Gandhi, who influenced him a lot on the whole question of nonviolence and civil disobedience. And then after he completed his studies, he went back to be a pastor in Montgomery. And it was then, shortly after he took over his pastorate, that the whole bus issue arose. That was in December 1st, 1955, when Rosa Parks refused to move to the back of the bus and was arrested. And it was at that time that Dr. King found himself propelled into this whole business of civil rights. He soon found himself elected as the president of the Montgomery Improvement Association, found himself a spokesperson for all of those individuals, and found himself really the leader of the bus boycott that they used in order to try to achieve some of their own civil rights. And as we know, then he carried on that career of nonviolent protest, of trying to win better rights for the blacks around the United States. He came north to Chicago and tried to work there, and then we know of his tragic assassination in 1968. I think it's important to realize a bit something of his intellectual development, too, that he did start out as a rather liberal kind of thinker. He was influenced by what we commonly know as liberal Protestant thought, which had a very optimistic viewpoint of human nature. And he found out after a while that that wasn't really the whole picture, that human beings weren't quite as good as he might have thought as he went through his theological studies. And it was at that time that he came into contact with the thought of Reinhold Niebuhr. And Niebuhr had this idea of the sinful side of human nature, and he saw that sin indeed was a social reality. So he talked about moral man and immoral society, that the society itself had sin and injustice built into it. And it was out of this mix that Martin Luther King perhaps found some sort of a middle ground between that liberal positive kind of thought and the neo-orthodox more pessimistic kind of thought. But another large influence really was Gandhi, as I mentioned before, and his whole idea of nonviolence. And Martin Luther King was very influenced by his trip to India when he went there and tried to see some of the fruits of the work that Gandhi had done in freeing all of India. Now, the important thing, of course, is to see how Martin Luther King embodies and reminds us of certain ideals of human freedom. And I think if we look a bit at his life and the kind of things he stood for, the kind of actions he performed in his life, we get some sort of a handle on how to begin to look at our own freedom and how perhaps we might strive to become more responsible and free individuals. I think the first thing that we have to see is that we should really view ourselves as free subjects who are responsible for ourselves as a whole and for the future. And I think this is something that Dr. King really brought to our minds. It was not enough just to drift in life. It wasn't just enough to take on the status quo as though that was sacrosanct and we could never change it in any way. He was a man who took hold of his own life, who responded to the situation as he saw it, and one who was constantly making that call to other people to try to grab hold like that. So we really are indeed responsible subjects. Now, there's some people around who don't think that way, who really even deny that. We think of B.F. Skinner in his book Beyond Freedom and Dignity, and in that book Skinner is trying to tell us that it really is not true that we are free. He says that we are more like Pavlov's dogs than like Hamlet's angels. And I think that needs to be countered as well. His idea was that if we pretended like we were free when we're really not, that this really hurt us and we didn't get around to programming our behavior and the behavior of others as we should. But I think in any kind of Christian understanding of freedom, we have to reject that. And in fact, any true humanistic understanding of freedom says, no, we are responsible subjects. We're responsible for our lives as a whole. We have the job of determining what we're going to be forever. We have to, in one way or another, take hold of our lives. And so our freedom, first of all, is a matter of shaping my character and personality. Even if Skinner could show us that in many ways we are determined in life and that there are certain causal things that make us act in a certain way, we often still have this sense that, however, I can take up an attitude towards all of those givens, all those determinations in life, those things that seem to be pressing me in one way or another, all of the ways I grew up and was trained and so on, they might be influencing me, but I always have the opportunity of taking up an attitude towards that. I can either be mad about it or begin to accept it. So in this way, I think we begin to see, indeed, that we are free, even if we are determined in many ways. I just thinking about Sartre's phrase that they were never so free as during the French resistance, during the German occupation, during the Second World War. He says we were never so free as during that time, despite the fact that their actions were circumscribed in many ways and they lived in a lot of fear and so on. He felt they were free because it was an act of will to overcome this occupying force, to show courage in the face of this terrible situation. That took effort. You had to pull yourself together and respond in a really courageous kind of way. So it is possible to be free, in other words, even if one is imprisoned, because one is able to take up an attitude towards that. Karl Rahner likes to say that freedom is really the capacity for the eternal. And what he means by that is that our freedom is not just the opportunity to choose this or that, to decide to go to a movie or not, or to eat a particular food or something else. It's not the capacity just to always change our mind and say, oh, I'm not going to do it the way I said I was going to do it. But freedom really is the capacity to do what is permanent, to make ourselves to be what we will be forever. Through our free actions, we are shaping our personality, determining our character. We're fixing it for what we will be forever. We are, through our actions on this earth, are deciding our eternal fate. And this puts a tremendous importance on freedom then, even what seems to be simple acts of freedom and small decisions and what we often call light matters and so on. All of those seem to have really a tremendous power and importance when we put it in this framework, that we are indeed shaping our personality or character. Sometimes people will say, well, it was just a little lie. It doesn't matter. Well, I tell little lies. That doesn't really amount to much. But in this perspective, we would say that we would never say that lying is just a simple or light matter. Because the fact of the matter is that if we keep lying, someday we're going to wake up and say, I am a liar. I no longer tell the truth. I'm not able to tell the truth. I find myself to be an habitual liar. I have formed my character in this way. So we can begin to see that even little decisions have a great consequence. So we want to locate freedom, first of all, as this root capacity to shape our very character. We're sort of, Hubert Humphrey used that line. Hubert said to the little boy, who are you? And the little boy said, I don't know, I'm not finished yet. And it sort of represents this attitude. We're not finished yet. We're in process of making ourselves. We're in process of determining what we will be forever. And that indeed really is a heavy kind of responsibility to place on ourselves. Now, I think Martin Luther King, by his actions in life, really showed this. He was the individual who said, we can't just wait around. We can't drift in life. One time in that letter from a Birmingham jail, he had this sentence. He says, this wait, they were telling him, well, you should wait. We don't want to get into this too soon. You should put off these marches and so on. And he's arguing against it. He says, this wait has always meant never. It has been a tranquilizing thalidomide, relieving the emotional stress for a moment, only to give birth to an ill-formed infant of frustration. In other words, he's telling us that if we just always drift and put it off to the future, then we really are not shaping ourselves. We're not doing what we should be doing. We're not meeting our responsibility. And of course, he said we're not going to wait. We have to move forward on this. And so Martin Luther King, I think, stands as an example here of the free subject, the responsible person who is not going to throw that off onto other people or say it's other people's problems, so on, but he's going to say, no, I must take hold and do whatever I can. And in doing that, he calls forth to us. Whenever we're in danger of just saying, well, I don't care, or I'm just going to drift along for a while, or tomorrow is good enough, or when I get older, I'll meet the challenge, or later on, I'll get over this particular fault of mine. Instead of that, he's saying, no, we must really respond in the present moment and try to make ourselves to be the best kind of people that we can be. Now, I think the second thing that I want to draw from this passing over to Martin Luther King of trying to see the world through his eyes is the notion that we really have to challenge some of the cultural notions we have of freedom in the United States. I like the image of the Marlboro Man as being an example of the kind of freedom that is often celebrated in the United States. It's the cowboy image. In the United States, it's often thought that the free person is the one who has no ties. The free person is not bound to any other individual. They can ride off on the horse somehow. They're not beholden to anybody else. They have a true autonomy. I remember when I was working in a warehouse and was piling up Lucky Strike cigarettes, cartons of those, and I would pile up about 50 Luckies to every one Marlboro. And at one time, Marlboro put a man out on a horse and a tattoo and put that ad on television, and before long I was piling up more Marlboro cartons than Luckies. It was one of the most successful advertising campaigns in history because it really touched something deep and important in the American psyche, I suppose especially the American males, that freedom means to be unattached, to be detached from personal relationships, to be able to go off and do one's own thing. And I think perhaps this is really strikes a responsive chord in many human beings in our society. Really, that kind of notion has a long history. You have to go all the way back to the time of the Enlightenment when people began to look at the various authority structures in their society and to say, well, I don't necessarily have to follow those. People were saying, looking at the church, for example, and saying, well, that's an institution, but I have to learn to think for myself. I can't just do what the church tells me. We found people rebelling against the given political order and structure of society. So it seems as though at that time of the Enlightenment, we began to move out of the medieval kind of world and into a world where people wanted to, at least in a beginning way, to do their own thing and to think for themselves. Many of the existentialist thinkers in the 19th and 20th century celebrated that idea. We can think of Kierkegaard and his whole idea that human beings have to somehow become individuals. I think that's what he wanted on his tombstone, the individual, the one who said no to Christendom as he knew it, the one who thought for himself and who tried to appropriate the Christian faith for himself. We can think of Friedrich Nietzsche in the 19th century also, who told us that human beings had to develop their own values, that God was dead now, this cultural absolute was gone, and if we were ever going to be authentic and real people, that we had to develop our own value system in life. And we think of the modern people like Martin Heidegger, 20th century, telling us that to achieve our authentic existence, we have to freely face our own death and life. And we think of Jean Paul Sartre and his notion that we are creating our own being, that existence really precedes essence, which means simply that we are creating ourselves, that we don't have a fixed essence, that we are making ourselves to be again what we will be forever. And I think that a lot of what we get in the modern psychology is really telling us the same kind of thing, that there is a way and we must individuate ourselves. Carl Jung talked a lot about that. We get a lot of the popular psychology today that talks about pulling our own strings and doing our own thing, and that the sky is the limit to what we can accomplish in life. So we have in the culture as a whole, it seems that Marlboro image, that image of the cowboy as really being the free person, has a long history. It's built up in our country. It's been part of our heritage. And it's gotten reinforced by a lot of the thinking in modern times, so that many intellectual and academic people as well talk that line. Now, I think that the life of Dr. King and what he had to say really challenges all of that for us. He tells us that there really is another way of looking at that whole business, and that is that we are indeed social creatures, that we find our identity only in the community. So Martin Luther King felt that there was power in numbers. You had to get the whole community together to rise up in this civil disobedience if any strides were ever going to be made. Many people in the civil rights movement who got involved found themselves working shoulder to shoulder with people of a different background, or perhaps a different race, and found in that a great exhilaration and liberation. People felt really free as they worked together on a common cause. They got the idea that freedom wasn't just going off and doing one's own thing, but working with other people on a great cause. That so many people, when they sang, "We shall overcome," or were involved in marches, or were trying in one way or another to work for racial justice, found themselves to be lifted out of their own selfishness. They found a new type of exhilarated living. Many people felt free at that time, and still there's certain nostalgia for those days when individuals really said, "I was alive in a new way during that time." So the truth of the matter really is that we are these social creatures, and that we are people who need just not to free ourselves from certain things, to get away from constraints, from authority figures and from institutions, but we have to be people who are free for as well. We have to be people who are free to love and serve others, free for worthwhile causes, free to enter into genuine relationships that are based on mutual love. As we sort of think about the way we grow up, we start out very dependent people. As little babies, we can't survive unless our parents take care of us. We need love to grow up properly. We need guidance as we go along. But as the child goes along and moves into adolescence, the child now wants freedom. The freedom to get away from the parental figures. There's a rebellious kind of stage that often takes over. So the adolescent wants to be independent and go his own way. She wants to do her own thing then. And the problem, I think, very often is that we somehow think that that's the end of the line, that to reach adolescence and that kind of independence is what the mature and full-grown human being is really all about. But as a matter of fact, that seems to be sort of a fixation. That doesn't seem to be this final stage in the growth process. We need to get beyond that and to realize that we are really interdependent creatures, that we move from dependence into independence, but then there's a new stage we're supposed to get to. And that new stage is one in which we recognize our need for other people, and we realize our responsibilities for others, where we think that we have responsibilities to the community as a whole, where we begin to sense that we are members of a neighborhood or of a parish or of a nation or of the whole human race, that we really are responsible for the well-being of all these different communities in which we live. So what we're trying to do, therefore, is reach sort of a creative combination of independence and dependence, which we might term interdependence, so that the really free person has moved away from just being a cowboy or a Marlboro man on a horse and has moved into a situation where he can relate easily and smoothly with other individuals, where he's not afraid to say, I need you, or I'm dependent upon you, or I need help from you. Not afraid to reach out to others and to show some emotion and to say, indeed, I need you to achieve my own wholeness or integration. And by the same token, the free person is able to keep their own needs in some sort of check, keep their own needs in bounds, so that they're able to say, all right, you need me now, I can reach out and help you. I'll set aside my own selfish interests now and look to yours. I'll try to think about how I can help the other people who have a call upon my time and energy. So that this interdependence represents a fuller notion of what freedom is all about. And it's that which I think Martin Luther King really brought to our mind in many ways. He lived that out. He had his own temptations to withdraw from the struggle and to just live his own life. But he didn't give in to those. He had a bigger dream in mind that kept him going. And he kept saying, no, I have to try to help my countrymen who are so downtrodden and oppressed. He kept that side of it there, and he showed that he could find his own fulfillment in that work, so that much of his own satisfaction in life came from the civil rights struggle and from his general efforts to help create a more humane world. Now, we should look at other aspects of freedom that we find from passing over to Dr. Martin Luther King. And this is clearly comes from his work with the oppressed, and that is that a big part of freedom is to find alternatives in life. A big part of the problem for many people in the United States and throughout the world is that they are imprisoned in a given system, that there's no way out, as our popes have talked about the hellish circle of poverty that many people live in. Many people find themselves enslaved by political, social, and economic systems. Social sin is a reality in our world. Something like 17% of the people in the world have 80% of the world's wealth. We know that so many people right here in the United States live in the ghettos and are enclosed in that circle of poverty and just can't even figure out how to get out. You hear some of these people interviewed who have been looking for jobs for so long, and they just begin to give up. Despair begins to take over, and they just feel no sense of freedom because there are no viable options for them in life. And again, Dr. King's work with the oppressed was so much along that line. He wanted to secure the rights for the blacks in the United States, voting rights, economic rights, their civil rights, so that they would indeed have options. I think Jesse Jackson in our own time has taken up that theme, that the idea is that to open doors for people in the United States, and then the important thing is to be able to walk through those doors, to take advantage of these new opportunities. Although I think it's true that when people have found themselves locked into these enslaving situations for a long period of time, it really does get difficult to grab hold of one's life. So that in this whole analysis, we're finding that freedom is really a social kind of concept. Whereas it's nice to say that when we're imprisoned, we could indeed take up an attitude towards it and say, well, I'm going to remain free during the resistance, as Sartre said, that we can't expect everyone to be able to respond positively like that. And we can't think that that is a full-blown freedom. It seems if we're going to work for freedom in our world and achieve our own freedom, it is because we try to create an environment where people really have viable options, where there are opportunities to work, for example, opportunities to move to other places, to create a good neighborhood, to build a house, to be able to have the worth and dignity that's involved in taking charge of one's own life. I think along this line we find that theme that Dr. King enunciated very often, that is that when some people in the world were enslaved, and in some way or another we were all enslaved, that we couldn't just keep it down to one saying, well, it's too bad for those people somehow, that they're in bad shape or whatever, but what does that have to do with me? This is the attitude I think we find very often with the people who are well off. So we're able to say, well, we're eating 3 meals a day and we got a roof over our head. Why should we worry about those other people who have it tougher? And there's sort of a certain type of enlightened self-interest in taking a broader view. That is, when other people's freedom is taken away, we're never too sure how soon it will be before ours is gone. How do we know that we're not going to end up in that same kind of situation? If some people can be enslaved, then others can be as well. And so it seems like to have genuine freedom in life, we have to keep working at it. We have to keep trying to get freedom for all the people around. Now, when we begin to look at our Christian and Judeo-Christian heritage on this, I think we begin to get more of a sense of the social character of freedom. Because we have to remember that in the Hebrew Scriptures, the great event of the Exodus involved God, Yahweh, giving His people economic and social and political freedom. He took them out from in the bondage in Egypt, got them out from under the thumb of Pharaoh, and gave them a land of their own. Gave them the opportunity to shape their own existence, to become His own people, and to respond to His call. It was a genuine freedom He gave them. It wasn't enough just to say, well, you're free, or you can say your prayers, or you can offer sacrifice to me. The model example of how God deals with us in the Hebrew Scriptures is to give a real concrete kind of freedom to His people, where they would have this opportunity to grow and develop in their own way and to practice their religion as they saw it. A social, economic, and political kind of freedom. That really gets echoed in the New Testament, in the Christian Scriptures as well, where Jesus Christ, when He gets up to say what His mission is all about, He goes back to those words in Isaiah that He's come to give sight to the blind and to give liberty to the captives, to make people free. That's what He came for. Paul talks about the freedom of the sons of God, that all of the sons and daughters of God are supposed to have this inherent dignity and worth, that they need their freedom, that they have to have the power of the Spirit within them so that they can respond spontaneously to the call of God and live it out in the real world. So I think we see that our Judeo-Christian heritage gives us a sense of this larger notion of freedom, of a political and economic social freedom, a kind of freedom that groups of people have to have. We get the sense that if certain groups are enslaved, then in one way or another God's will is not being done. Kind of image of God that results from all of this talk is that God is one who is trying to free his people. God is one who is on our side. He's with us all the way. He's fighting oppression and enslavement wherever it is to be found. He doesn't want human suffering. He wants us to have the opportunity to use the talents and gifts that he has given to us. So, Martin Luther King, again, in passing over to him and looking at his life, we have to be impressed. Here's a man, I would say, who would live at what we call stage 6 morality, according to Kohlberg's stages. He's the one who would break the law, but would be willing to go to jail for breaking the law, precisely so that the law could be overturned, so that its injustice could be shown forth, and so that other people wouldn't have to live under those oppressive kinds of laws. So he put his body on the line for this. I think this is an important part, really, of trying to become a free person and a responsible individual. I remember addressing a group of people who were involved in one of the protest movements during the Vietnam War, and it was a question of symbolic kind of actions, and people were talking about digging a bomb crater on campus and so on. And I remember I was asked to speak to the gathering, and one of the points that I made was that the true prophet does not run away from his own actions, that the true prophets like Martin Luther King were ready to take the consequences for breaking the law. So it didn't make sense to run out in the middle of the night and dig this bomb crater and deface the campus and then go and hide someplace. That the real witness to the truth, the really free person, the person who's responsible, would go about digging the bomb crater and then being there to be arrested for this act, or in some other way to try to put the body on the line and not just let the axe sit there. I suppose if we think of many of the peace demonstrations in our own time, and we think of the Berrigan brothers, for example, people who are willing to go to jail for their principles so that they can get the situation changed. I think that really perhaps is what the legacy of Martin Luther King is. Now we have a fourth kind of notion here of freedom that I want to get from Dr. King, and that is that we need the dream to guide us. We need an ideal in front of us that will galvanize our efforts and to get us into action, something that will get us off dead center. Of course, when you use the word dream and think of Martin Luther King, you think of his great speech where he talks about the dream that he himself had, the great dream of living out the ideals of the founding of our country, and all those powerful words that he gave as a dream about his children being with other children and living in harmony, black and white, trying to work together. A powerful and beautiful dream. All the way along the line, it seemed like he functioned in the civil rights movement that way, always telling the people it could be better, always calling upon the dominant society to live out the dream that we professed in our founding documents, and to be true to that dream of our own nation and to the dream of the Scriptures where God wanted all people to live in harmony. Now, this highlights one of the problems that very often we have with freedom. And that is that we find ourselves paralyzed in one way or another, sort of impotent, unable to act in life. We find ourselves sort of getting the blahs, not really being able to get into action, getting tired of making decisions. I remember talking to one guy who had to do that all the time, and he just said, I'm going on vacation, I'm not going to make any decisions for 2 weeks, nothing. I mean, it's just, he's glutted with all the time having to engage his freedom. And I think very often that people sort of get into this mood generally, a paralysis of the will, a sort of a loss of a sense of personal responsibility. I think our culture seems to spawn this in many ways. We live a fast-paced and busy life, many demands made upon us. A lot of times it feels like a rat race. We just say, boy, if I could just get out of this whole business, I'd be better off. I'd feel a lot better. A lot of times I think the world of television and advertising creates a sort of passivity. There's that book on television television called The Plug-in Drug by Marie Wynn. And I think, I don't know if all the studies really corroborate that, but I do have the sense that very often the watching of television creates a certain passivity, and as opposed to being actively engaged in the world. There's a lot of the psychological language makes it sound like we're just driven by our instincts, that we got certain emotions. We can't help it. We just feel like doing it, so we got to do it. Our drives are there, and so we're just a victim of those, a victim of our emotions. It seems as the technological society advances and grows, we often have the sense that, well, we're overwhelmed by it. What are you going to do about it? The world just has its own momentum. We find ourselves in Max Weber's iron cage of bureaucracy. The bureaucracy, you want something done, you got to go through so many forms or see so many people, and after a while you think, well, it's really not worth it. Why should I continue to try like this? So perhaps that in our world we lose so many battles against the institutions. The great problems seem so intractable. How are we ever going to solve them? The great problems of peace and war and the racial questions and the environmental matters, they're so monstrous. How could we ever do anything about them? And I think very often then we find ourselves maybe saying, well, I'm not going to do anything about it. I'm just going to sit around. I'll just become passive. I'll let the other people worry about it. I'm tired of hitting my head against the wall, tired of trying to make any progress on these issues. Now, I think we really have to fight that, and when we look at Dr. King's life, I think we find a powerful catalyst in the other direction. He was dealing with monumental evils, great societal problems. And yet he insisted in making a start on them. He well knew that he wasn't going to turn the whole thing around just in his own lifetime. He understood that this was going to take time to do, but yet he was willing to work at it. Time and again he found opposition in his life. Time and again things didn't work like he wanted them to, but he kept coming back and he wouldn't give up. No one would turn him back, he said. He would continue his fight. I think that for psychic health, it's vitally important that we fight this whole tendency towards apathy and paralysis. And one of the ways we do that is by being able to dream, to have a dream of something better. Rollo May talks about that in his book Love and Will when he's talking about dealing with people who are depressed. And he says part of the problem of depression is that people can't envision it ever getting any better. They're always thinking, well, why should I try because I'm imprisoned in this crummy situation? So one of the things he tries to do in his therapy is to get people to imagine a better future. Dream a little bit about how it could be if you put your mind to it. Where is it that you want to get? And he found out that in his therapy that when people actually began to feel that, or to play with the possibilities in their mind, or imagine a better future, then at times they were able to say, yeah, and I could take some steps to get there. I could try. So having the dream seems to be an essential part of being a free individual. It really is something we have to keep in front of us, and I think we have to be thankful to the prophets in our midst and the inspiring people who keep challenging us, who say, hey, don't just settle for mediocrity. Don't just give up the whole thing. You really have to try. It can be better. I find in my own marriage counseling that very often it reaches a stage where people just say, I'm not going to try anymore because it can't get any better. And all they're thinking about is all the crummy times, all the arguments, all the disharmony that's existed in their marriage, and they become so filled up with that idea that they just say, that's it, and I don't want to live like that anymore, and I've got to get out of this. And very often, I think the key to straightening out the marriage is when people can begin to envision a better future. If you can just get one good thing to happen to them, and then latch on to that and say, hey, look, that was a neat time. Look at you talked with one another. You had a good time. There was fun. There was laughter. Why couldn't you have more moments like that? Why couldn't that become the shape of your life together for the future? And if people can begin to latch on to that, very often it is a catalyst for beginning to work at the marriage. So I think for our own mental health, we clearly need the dream, the ideal. If we're going to be free people and really shape our character and personality, then we have to have some ideal of where we're going, something in front of us to draw us, to give us a picture, an image of the kind of person we want to be. And surely, as we think of our societal responsibilities, the dream is absolutely vital. The dream of Dr. King remains one that could easily galvanize the nation, one that we need to hear again. The dream that indeed the black people and the white people could work together, that men and women could cooperate, that we could find a way for people who disagree on economic matters in this country to find a way to live in harmony and work together to produce a better country. Ways in which nations that are at war have to find a way to get along. So the dream of a one world, of a great human mass that's unified together, living on spaceship Earth with a common destiny and trying to make it a better place, that becomes the grandest dream of all. It is the dream of the Christian kingdom notion. In the Bible we talk about the kingdom of God, a kingdom that we have to strive for and try to build. The kingdom is a utopian ideal. It's a kingdom is already present here wherever good things are going on. And yet it remains a future reality that we have to strive for. So in our Christian symbol system and in the teachings of Jesus about the kingdom, we really find that dream enunciated. That's why we need to go back to our scriptures often and go back to our liturgy so that we can rekindle the dream, so we can keep going on a day-to-day basis. Now there's still another thing that I want to see about the question of freedom here, and that is that our freedom is always threatened by sin and guilt. And all the kind of idealistic talk I'm doing here about how freedom ought to be, we can't forget that it often isn't that way. That we are constantly threatened to fall back into an egocentric kind of approach to life. We're always threatened by paralysis in life, inactivity, passivity. We're always in danger of thinking only of ourselves or our own narrow interest and not the larger world. So indeed, the fact of the matter is that we are people who experience a gap between our ideals and our actual performance. We can talk glowingly of freedom and of the dream, but we've got to learn to deal with the fact that we don't live up to it, either as individuals or as a society. And that's the way the human situation is. We have to recognize our own weakness in this. And I think that's where we get some sense of our need for help in life. That we need other people, that we need a larger community, that we need our religious tradition to help us. What we need most of all is the notion of a God who forgives us. Because when we do fall into sin, and when we fail to meet our responsibilities, then we're in danger of saying, well, I'm not going to try anymore. I'm going to sort of wallow in self-pity here. I'm just going to fall down and not get up again. And here's where we need the encouragement. This is when we find the need for the community. We need other people around who will say, that's all right. We all sin. We all make mistakes. But let's try again. We need the models that we find in the Scriptures. We need to look at that contrast between Judas and Peter. Both denied the Lord. Judas could not rebound from that, and yet Peter bounced back, began again, received the words of forgiveness from the Lord. Peace be with you, and was able to function then as the leader in the apostolic community. So, a realistic notion of freedom seems to be absolutely vital, the sense that it's threatened. It's always threatened in our own person and in other individuals, threatened by sin and by guilt. And the best thing we can do in those situations is to admit that, be realistic about it, and when we do falter and when we do sin, to admit it, ask for God's forgiveness, and to get on with it. And that's the way we begin, again, to shape our personality in a constructive kind of way. Then we're people who don't just drift in life, but take hold. Martin Luther King clearly was one who was able to rise above the difficult circumstances of life. He continuously had to deal with the downs. He had to deal with a whole sinful situation in the world. And he had to deal with his own mistakes and failures like every other human being, but he didn't get bogged down in that. He constantly felt that indeed it was possible to make progress. So again, by passing over to Martin Luther King, we get a picture of freedom. We want to understand this ideal. The question at hand we've been dealing with is, how do we indeed achieve a genuine freedom in life. It's a practical question. It is a religious question. It forces us into the very depths of our being. And it forces me to ask myself, what kind of person do I want to become? How can I become more responsible? How can I be a better member of the various communities? Because I am indeed a free subject. I'm called by my God, and I must learn to respond completely and wholeheartedly.
All rights to this talk are reserved by St. Anthony Messenger Press, 1615 Republic Street, Cincinnati, Ohio, 45210.